Okay, I'd like to go on to Eddie Michon now. Maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 10 minutes for questions. We're cutting a bit short on the questions. I'm sorry.
We are indeed. It's some very interesting points about the policy as well. I mean, I think in this country, a policy statement was issued shortly after the Second World War at the Nuremberg trials, which means that you can't rely on just following orders as legal defence, and that is enshrined under international law. Why are our countries not going back to that basic principle? Okay, well, it's a harrowing story, and it makes me all the more determined to try and fight to protect future journalistic sources and future whistleblowers, but I'll get on to that in about 15 minutes or so, if you'll bear with me. I could not resist. Thank you very much to the organisers for asking me to speak at this event on three of my favourite topics, which have grandiose titles in the heading for the speech, but actually is spies, geeks, and the media. Three of my all-time favourite topics, and I've been given licence to be as rude as I want about the old media this afternoon, so let's get to it. The reason I want to do that, I am a whistleblower of the old school. Way back in the 1990s, almost 20 years ago now, I was employed as a British intelligence officer working for the UK Domestic Security Service, MI5. And I met there my former partner and colleague, a man called David Shaler, who became a very infamous or very famous whistleblower in the late 1990s. We worked there in MI5 for 6 years each, and it was the marginally golden ethical era of their 100-year existence, because they'd only just been put on a legal footing for the first time. They had not officially existed up until 1989. And of course, this was prior to 9/11, when the intelligence gloves came off around the planet, and MI5 and the CIA and all the other alphabet soup agencies slithered down a moral decline towards torture and kidnapping and drone assassination attacks. So for about 10, 12 years, they tried to do good, almost. But despite that, and despite only working there for 6 years, we saw so many things going wrong that we felt, even then, compelled to resign and compelled to go to the media to expose the crimes we had witnessed. Now, I won't dwell too long on those, but just as headlines, we saw files being held on government ministers, our top politicians. In fact, the very people who went on to become the political masters of the UK spy agencies had information held on them by those spy agencies, which is a dreadful problem, I think, for a democracy. It's very much a tail wagging the dog. We also saw thousands, hundreds of thousands of files held on innocent UK citizens for their political beliefs, their democratic actions. We saw illegal telephone taps against journalists. We saw innocent people being imprisoned on trumped-up charges, despite the fact that MI5 had evidence they were innocent, but they failed to disclose that evidence to court. We saw provisional IRA bombs exploding on UK streets, which could and should have been prevented by the secret police and by MI5. And then the spies lying to their government masters to cover up these mistakes, so they never learnt from those mistakes. And the whole time there culminated in the case that made us quit. And this became known as the Gaddafi assassination plot, which occurred in 1996. Now here this was MI6, which is sort of James Bond foreign intelligence agency, a bit like the CIA. They were involved in funding and helping to arrange an assassination attempt against Colonel Gaddafi of Libya. And to do this, they actually funded what they called a ragtag group of Islamic extremists in Libya, which even then were known to MI5 and MI6 as Al-Qaeda. They funded this group to try and carry out an attack against Gaddafi, which was illegal under UK law, which manifestly went wrong because Gaddafi survived to be assassinated by the very same agencies and organisations in 2011, and it also killed innocent people, innocent bystanders on the street. So we couldn't think of anything more heinous than this. We had not signed up to an intelligence community in Britain to become involved in what was effectively state-sponsored terrorism, which kill innocent people abroad. So we resigned and we blew the whistle. Now, under UK law, if you go public, it's a bit like with the military laws in the US. It is very black and white. You sign what is called the Official Secrets Act, which means that you cannot say anything about your work to anyone ever outside the agencies. Otherwise, you are breaking the Official Secrets Act and you face imprisonment. So what to do? It was a risk. We decided to go public. We approached the newspapers, they ran with the stories, this was in the late 1990s, and as a result we ended up literally going on the run around Europe. We were proto-Snowdens. We preemptively went on the run before the story broke. We ended up living in hiding, literally in the far south of France, for a year. We ended up living in exile for a total of 3 years, and my former partner David Shaler went to prison not once but twice. First of all, when the British failed to extradite him from France to stand trial for a breach of the Official Secrets Act in 1998. And then secondly, after he had voluntarily returned to the UK in order to face trial and in order to have a proper investigation initiated into the assassination plot against Gaddafi. And he was found guilty inevitably, and he went to prison again. So he was inside, not for very long. I mean, we weren't facing things like 35 years in prison, which is just totally disproportionate. But he was still facing 6 years and ended up serving 6 months in total. But I suppose what was worse was some lessons we learned from that era of our life. And first of all was the lack of privacy, because this is one of the things we're here to discuss today, this nature of surveillance, the nature of this panopticon that we now find ourselves inadvertently living under. And because we put ourselves in a rather unusual situation 15, 16 years ago by blowing the whistle and annoying the spies and being pursued across Europe, we know what it's like to be watched constantly, to be surveyed, to be spied on. And I say that in every which way, and this is of course the analogue era as well, so the capabilities are far greater now. But even then we knew that our telephones were being intercepted. We knew that our emails were read. We knew that we could not rely on privacy in our own home. The idea that we wanted to have a conversation in our living room or go to the bedroom, even that we could not assume was private. And also we found out afterwards that some of our friends had been pressured by the secret police and the spies to report on us. They were forced to report back to the spy agencies. So we were being watched every which way in those days. And I have to say that even though you try and blank it out, even though you try and joke about it and say, I'm having more fun than they are, who cares? It is still very corrosive to feel that everything you say, everything you do is being watched and listened to. And you start to self-censor. And it inhibits normal social relations as well. So, for example, if I wanted to have a private conversation about a family matter with my mother or something, we inhibited our conversation because we could not guarantee we had privacy, even for that. So it's a very corrosive situation. And it irritates me now when we have a situation where people say, well, if you've got nothing wrong, if you're doing nothing wrong, you've got nothing to hide. It doesn't matter, because the very fundamental is not about whether you're doing anything wrong. Well, two issues. One, you might not be doing anything wrong now, but roll forward 5, 10 years, what you're doing now might then be deemed to be a crime. So, for example, you're out there demonstrating or part of an Occupy camp, or you're an activist on the streets or something, perfectly legitimate nowadays, but in 5 or 10 years, the law might have changed and you might be deemed to be a domestic extremist or a terrorist. And we all know what happens to terrorist suspects these days. So, of course, everything being hoovered up, everything being stored, means that any information of what you do now can retroactively be used against you in the future. But it's more about a principle as well. After the Second World War, we had the principle of privacy enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and for a very, very good reason. Because if you don't feel you have that privacy in what you read, in what you write, in what you say, in what you watch, in what you plan as active citizens, then you will again start to self-censor in what you do. And that means democracy has died. So that is the nature of what it's like to live under surveillance, and why, in my view, it is so fundamentally important to a functioning democratic way of life. But the other thing that I learned as well, coming out of the whistleblowing years, and this is where I get to talk about my favourite subject, the media. Because it was bad enough to watch my partner being prosecuted and going to prison twice for exposing the crimes of others, and they were never even arrested or questioned about it. But then what happened to him in the media, the old media, this is pre, the Fifth Estate, was actually worse. It was a sort of personality rape, I think is the best way of putting it, where at the end of his court case, the judge said he agreed that Mr. Shaler had done what he'd done in the public interest, there was no financial motivation, and that no lives had ever been put at risk by his whistleblowing. And yet the headlines the next day said precisely the opposite. Shayla sells agent lives down the river for money, or some such rubbish. And I was thinking, hang on, I was in the same courtroom as the journalists who wrote the stories. What were they taking down in their shorthand? And that got me thinking about how the spies and how the government and how the intelligence community can manipulate what was the media then and what is now, I consider, the old, dead, dying media. You know, the newspapers, the mainstream television, the mainstream radio, which is static and inert. And certainly in the UK, and the UK is a past master of control and spying and secrecy, and I think the US is learning very quickly and unfortunately, very quickly catching up on what the UK has been doing for 100 years. The UK is a past master at controlling things like the media. They use a combination of soft and hard power. The soft power... Past master, yeah. The UK is a past master of control of the media. They use a combination of soft and hard power. The soft being the charm offensive against the journalists. Come and join us. Come and receive stories from us. Repeat what we want to say in the media. Support our position. Come into the secret circle. And it's terribly seductive. I know, I was recruited. I know how seductive it is. And then you get the next level where they are then asked, well, you've been a useful outlet for our information. How about you help us a bit back? Become an agent of influence within your newsroom. Tip us off if there is a story that is potentially embarrassing, or help to massage a story that might be harmful to us coming out of your news agency. And then you get the higher level meshings between the editors and the proprietors of the media and the top spies and the top politicians. And we've seen this not only with the lies around the war, the justification for the war in Iraq, but also on a more sordid level in the UK with the phone hacking scandal between Rupert Murdoch's media and the celebrities. You know, the media was sort of going into the phones and getting the messages for the celebrities and getting tip-offs as well from the police. So every which way, there is meshing at different levels between the journalists and the spies and the editors and the proprietors and the top spies and the top politicians. It is an establishment which closes ranks against dissenters, and it closes ranks against whistleblowers, and it will cover up and protect those on the inside. So that's the soft power, but the hard power is where the law comes into play. The stick is used against journalists who do want to report and do want to expose and do want to do what is basically their job, what they are paid to do as journalists, which is hold power to account, speak truth to power. And if the UK journalists do this, they can be prosecuted, they can be threatened under a whole battery of different UK laws. Not just what we saw going on with The Guardian, where the powers of the state go in and smash up a couple of hard disks. They can be prosecuted under terrorism legislation. They can be prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act itself, just like the whistleblowers, for breach of Section 5, although they do have one defence, which is if they do not cause damage to national security, they will not be prosecuted. They can be threatened with injunctions, with governmental injunctions. They can be threatened and self-censor under something called the Defence Press Advisory Committee in the UK, which is a self-censoring mechanism where top media types and top spies sit around a table, look at a story and decide, okay, we won't publish this bit because it might harm national security. And this is precisely why I think in the UK we've seen far less discussion of the Snowden disclosures across the wider old media, because there is indeed a D-notice in place because it's supposedly damaging to British national security. So there's a whole range of laws they can use to threaten journalists with, as well as just cutting them out of the secret charm circle. So it's very easy to manipulate public perception through the old media. Now, of course, the good side is we have the internet, and we even indeed still have pockets of free internet, I gather, thanks to all the geeks and the hacktivists. So if we can mobilise that, we can use that to build a meaningful fifth estate to counter this old inert media that is effectively part of the establishment, does the bidding of the spies. Then at least we can still get information out there. We can still have the freedom to ingest information and communicate information freely and in a democratic manner that will challenge the status quo. So I think in terms of pushback against this panopticon, that is one way we can do it. The other, of course, is through the law. It's been great that the European Parliament has been taking evidence from so many whistleblowers and so many experts about how they can protect European citizens from illegal snooping by this global surveillance state, which of course come from the US intelligence agencies. And it's frightening hearing what's going on in the US and what's going on to your constitutional rights and to US citizens. But as you said earlier, Bill, that provides no protection whatsoever anyway to the rest of us. We are all foreigners here. We have no protection under whatever laws are now put in place to protect the US citizens within US borders, even if those meaningfully work, because they can always ask the Brits to do the dirty work for them. So we have a situation now where unless we take that power legally back into our control across Europe, and we can, hopefully, and perhaps build up the European knowledge base and infrastructure to avoid this over-reliance on the US infrastructure and networks and cloud systems and all the other rubbish that's backdoored to the nth degree, then we have a chance to get some sort of autonomy back. But the final way we can push back, the final way, is of course to encourage whistleblowers to come out. They are the regulators of last resort. When every other aspect of democratic accountability and oversight and control of the shadowy, secret state operating behind our governments, the intelligence infrastructure, when all of that accountability has been proven to have failed time and time and time and time again over decades, not just since 9/11, then the only thing we can rely on to get to the truth is the whistleblower. And also those who support and help those whistleblowers to get that information out, which of course is not the old mainstream media. Generally these days, they are too corrupted and too controlled and too complicit. So that's why initiatives like WikiLeaks have been so starkly beautiful to someone who has been involved in blowing the whistle. As soon as I heard about it, I just thought, fabulous, a direct conduit, a high-tech conduit between the whistleblower and the people who need to see that information, with no chance of blockages and with no chance of the government getting their hands on the documentary proof of what the whistleblower is saying. That is what the idea of WikiLeaks provides, and all power to them and all power to future models of that sort of organisation. But the other thing we need to be aware of, and just to finish, is the idea of what happens to the poor bloody whistleblower at the end of the process too. Because it's great for the journalists, they get all the plaudits, they get all the awards, they make their careers. They make their careers. The whistleblower, whose information actually makes those careers, always ends up, at the very least, breaking their own careers. They will lose, at the very least, their professional life, their professional status, their means to make a good living. And what are they left with? Usually a ruined reputation. If they're unlucky, they will be in prison, they will have a criminal record. If they're really unlucky, they will end up facing the death penalty, as Chelsea Manning almost did, and Edward Snowden might still do. So one way we can encourage future whistleblowers is to show that they can survive the process. Not just survive, but thrive and build a new life and be seen to have the support globally from the grateful citizens of the world and what they've done, their sacrifice they've made, and what they've risked by showing the world what is going badly wrong behind the scenes. Which is why many of us are now getting together to launch a new organisation, which Gianni mentioned right at the start. It's called Courage. And this is the new name that has evolved from an organisation, and I always have trouble saying this, Journalistic Source Protection Defence Fund. So if you see those letters floating around, it's now much more simply called Courage, the fund to protect journalistic sources. And we will be there to raise money so they can fight their legal battles, to advocate for the ideas behind whistleblowing and what they whistleblow is so important. Because quite often they're not in a position themselves to be free to say and contextualise, this is important because of this is important because of that, socially, for all of us. So please keep an eye out for the launch of Courage over the next couple of months, and please spread the word, donate if you can, because it'll all go to a very good cause to protect not just existing at-risk whistleblowers such as Edward Snowden, but also to encourage and entice out future whistleblowers as our last regulators, as our regulators of last resort, the last defences for our democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annie.